connections that will propel our industry and academia towards sustainable growth and enhance efficiency. We recognize that the landscape we operate in is evolving rapidly, influenced by technological advancements, environmental imperatives, and shifting market dynamics. Therefore, your presence here today underscores your commitment to charting a course that maximizes value in the industry and academia. I'm also confident that the conversations that will unfold over the course of this discussion, this meeting, will illuminate new paths and inspire novel solutions. Let us engage with vigor, respect for different viewpoints, and a relentless pursuit of advancement. Thank you all for being a part of this vital technical to business meeting for Warri Technical Business Meeting today. So I use this opportunity also to appreciate all experts that are on the call, all fellows that are on the call. Thank you for attending today. I especially appreciate the president of NAPE, Mr. Elliot Ibe, for making our time to be here today. So I'll call on the president also to give us a presidential speech before we go ahead. Mr. President, sir.
Good morning, Prof. Thank you. Good morning, all. On behalf of the Board of Trustees, the Advisory Council, and the Executive Committee of NAPE, I just want to thank you all for also making time out to attend these Warri chapter business and technical meeting for this month. I think these meetings always provide the right platform for us as professionals and members of the academia to exchange ideas and listen to insightful exposés on geoscience phenomena and associated areas of interest to us as geoscientists, especially as we go into the different transitions that we are faced with, not just in the technical front, but also in our socio-economic environment. I also want to thank the speaker for today's presentation, Dr. Ifeanyi Obi. I almost call him FNAPE. He's been a feature in the geoscience community, not just in Nigeria, but around the world. And listening to him speak, I'm sure that we will get a different perspective because he's a very hands-on member of our community. I also want to thank the sponsoring chapter, the Warri chapter, championed by our newly minted professor. We expect good things as usual from this chapter, and we're never disappointed. To all our members and staff of the association, we thank them for their taking time out to attend this. And as we go on, looking forward to a very successful outing today. So thank you very much, Prof, and thank you all for your attendance.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, sir.
Dr. Olima, over to you.
Okay. Good morning once again. I just want to stand on existing protocol and say thank you to the NAPE community for connecting to our NAPE Warri chapter technical and business unit. I just want to, first of all, reiterate the topic. It's an interplay between strata thicknesses, timing of deformation, and genetic styles in linked tectonic provinces, implications for hydrocarbon accumulation. Now, I just want to encourage every one of us because I am super excited already concerning the topic of today. You know, it's just like combining geology and the economy of a whole nation in three interrelated elements, which has to do with stratigraphy, timing, and tectonism. I don't want to waste any much of our time. I want to encourage every one of us connected to this exciting discussion to be focused, to listen, to learn, because on my own, I'm already prepared for it. And I hope that our guest speaker will deliver because he has been introduced by our president. I am not a talk about what he's going to do today. I'm excited, and I know everyone watching us is excited to see what is happening in the oil industry in just 3 elements. So I welcome every one of us to this presentation, and I am inviting to deliver this subject of today, the topic of today, the person of Dr. Ifeanyi Obi. Dr. Ifeanyi Obi has over 10 years working experience in the industry and is currently a senior geoscientist with ExxonMobil Corporation. He has gathered experience working different deep water and shallow water fields at exploration and production scales in both extensional and compressional settings within the Niger Delta Basin. Obi is an active member of the SCG and AAPG, where he currently volunteers as District 9 Rep and Students Coordinator, Africa Region, respectively. He is a founder of an online geoscience platform, GeoCap Institute, primarily for online learning and knowledge sharing. He loves hiking and movies, and I know he loves geology. And I'm presenting to you this moment the person of Dr. Ifeanyi Obi. Thank you, Ifeanyi. So you can take up from there.
Thank you, ma'am, for that introduction. And thanks for everyone, our NAPI president, our professor in the room, and everyone, friends of the subsurface. I call all of us friends of the subsurface. Thank you for finding time to attend. I will really appeal that you be patient with me. My pattern of discussing this might be unconventional. I'm not one of those tie-wearing managerial folks who, they speak in big terms. I may very much, surprise you by using very unconventional means. So please, I appeal that you understand my style, and just let's do this. So the topic, I'm going to start sharing. What does that mean? I'm going to start sharing if it's okay. Okay, let me start sharing my screen here. All right, so kindly confirm if you can see a screen.
Not yet, it's coming up.
Okay. All right, so like as introduced, it says the interplay between, strata thicknesses, timing of deformation, and genetic trap styles in linked tectonic provinces. And then we'll look at how that impacts, chances of finding hydrocarbon or not. Has it come up yet? So I just, before I go on.
Yes.
Screen. All right, okay, great. So I won't go through the abstract detail, but the most important I want to say here is that there are 3 key things we're looking at here: thicknesses of stratal packages, timing of deformation of these rocks. In other words, when the rock deformation started, and then we'll also progress to look at what happens thereafter, the different phases of deformation on rocks and their impact on the integrity of traps. And then we will find a way to look at a couple of scenarios where, depending on the sequence of or deformation, a trap worked or did not work, as well as some structural trap styles or play examples that we have in some of these regions of the Niger Delta Basin. So let's go on this ride together. Okay. So first thing, as a subsurface fellow, what you do ask yourself is a trap working, right? What am I going to find? Am I going to find oil? Am I going to find gas? Or is it going to be wet or nothing? Okay, so that's the first question we ask ourselves as subsurface scientists. Okay, so if we move on, this is the outline. I'm going to walk you through introduction, traps, and rock deformation. We'll look at strata thicknesses and timing of force. The key thing here, if you don't take anything out, is how to figure out when did it fold. When was the first time that a stratal unit started getting folded? And then when was the first time faulting actually started in a particular section? that will help you because it helps you in the way you see your trap, the integrity of your trap, as well as whether it works or not. We'll also look at sequences, scenarios where you have multiple polyphase deformation and their impact on trap integrity. We'll look at it in different tectonic provinces. And then a few examples of some hydrocarbon trapping scenarios, and then we'll go ahead and conclude. One disclaimer here is that everything I'm talking about speaks to siliciclastics and not carbonates. So carbonate trapping is a different ball game, but everything in here is primarily for siliciclastics. So what is a trap? I think pretty much we know this, right? Any arrangement, any configuration, right, of rocks that has the capacity to keep hydrocarbon in place for a long time, okay? So in other words, you can have a trap due to formational boundaries, and those boundaries might be physical, stratigraphic boundaries, or pressures, And then when I say stratigraphic, I'm speaking to, let's say, changes in rock facies, or where you have baffles or barriers that actually help create that configuration and keep the hydrocarbon in place. And then we also keep in mind that after a trap is formed, or when the rocks, when sediments are deposited, they do undergo sometimes single, sometimes multiple phases of alterations from the original state and contribute to whether the trap you are looking at works or not. So this is just, again, for you who visually appreciate things. I know we all do, what traps could look like, right? So this is an example, one on a seismic section. The other one is from an outcrop, which is taken from one of the locations in Enugu, right here. In the section is a subsurface. It's a Niger Delta example. You see that, curved, concave downwards geometry. That is what we are looking for as subsurface scientists. And then on some other settings, you see a normal fault, either on the hanging wall or the footwall side of the fault. You might have a configuration that will keep hydrocarbon. So let's just keep this in mind as subsurface scientists thinking about these things. Where do we have our structure? What's the juxtaposition trend? Okay, what materials do we have in the fault plane? What's the offsets between these stratigraphic units? Okay, so you keep all that in mind. And what's the history, right? So those are things that, as we're looking at this, we're thinking about these things. Can you hear me? Just by confirmation, can anyone confirm if you can still hear me?
Yes.
I hear you.
All right, great. So let's look at rock deformation, basically. So first of all, this is a bit on the much regional scale. Okay, we may have heard of plates movements. We have about 12 to 15 tectonic plates, right? So they're either moving away from each other, towards each other, or sliding side by side each other. So when they're moving away, you're going to have what we call extensional tectonics. When they're moving towards, like here, you have the oceanic plates moving towards, let's say, continental plates, and there's some form of collision, like you can see in the middle section. The oceanic kind of subducts below the overlying continental, plate. What you now see is some kind of, compression. And when that happens, you also see the accompanying features in that area where you have the subductions that are just above it. And then in some other settings, you have some kind of sliding or tearing of these systems, in which case you're looking at, transform areas. And what you have below are sketches that I've made just to give you a picture of what you expect. So where you have crustal stretching, things are normally faulted. Where you have crustal shortening, you see some kind of buckles forming in the form of fold, right? And then where you have shearing, you either have these signatures where you have like a mini basin or a pop-up structure like you see on the bottom right. Okay, so we do keep all of this in mind as we look at our basins. The question we're asking ourselves is, where are we in the sub-regional setting? Are we in this area where you have stretching or shortening or shearing? But a quick thing to note is that for Niger Delta, the kind of buckles or folds that we see are not because you have plates moving towards each other. I just need to say that up front. They are driven by, it's a different setting, space constraints leading to buckling of structure. But we'll look at that in detail. But because the Niger Delta is a passive margin, the folded systems you're seeing are not really as a result of plate collision or crustal shortening, right? It's a different scenario. So we'll talk more on that as we look at more sections on seismics. So this, again, is just for you to visually appreciate what nature can really do to our rocks. Top right, you're seeing, normally faulted. On the top left, you're seeing the normally faulted outcrops. On the top right, you also see like a monocline. Again, it shows you what the rocks go through because of the different tectonic settings. And then the bottom left, you see chevron folds. In the middle of it, you see normally folded system, and then your far right, bottom right, you see just a normal fold, simple anticline. And cool thing that these are pictures that I have taken myself. So it's fun seeing these things yourself and knowing that it's not just sketches that you see in text.
Hello, Dr. Ifeanyi, are you there?
Yes.
I think he lost connection. We should expect him back.
Okay, so let's just hold on. I'm sure he will connect back.
Yes. He will be back.
Hello, please, Dr. Ifeanyi Obi is trying to reconnect. They just had some patience, he's trying to reconnect.
I apologize. I didn't know I was offline. I just got called and I was told that. I apologize, everyone. Please confirm if you can see my slide and let me know where I stopped,
Yes.
please.
We can see you. We can hear you.
Okay, where did I stop? Can you recall
slide 9? Slide 9. You stop at slide 9.
9.
Okay. All right. Thank you. All right. So everyone, thank you. I apologize for that mix-up. The host has stopped. So I can't start my video. That's fine. I don't even need the video now. Okay. So this is just visually to give us a kind of appreciation of some.
You need to be on slide mode.
Yeah, it's on slide mode. Yeah. So the top left shows you some normally faulted settings. Top right.
Video if you want to.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Faulted systems. Top right is again you see that like a monocline, which is indicative of a different setting. In this case, compressional. And then bottom left is a chevron fold. And then far right, bottom right is a normal anticline. And these are just showing you what nature can do or what nature does to these rocks, and just for our own visual appreciation. Okay, so the next question we ask ourselves is, how are traps formed? Two things: how are traps formed, and then when did the first deformation happen? Okay, so why are we looking at this? Why are we asking ourselves those questions? Because we want to know, what happened after the initial success story of a trap being formed has been attained. Okay, so in looking at traps, we're asking ourselves a few questions here. What's the nature of the rock? Is that a sandy rock? Is it a shaly rock? What is that item, that material that folded to form a trap itself? And then what thicknesses do I see? What's the trend? And what's the implication of that? And then the next question you ask yourself, which I had said, was timing as well as the history of deformation. And why do we ask these questions? We want to know the pre-kinematic or synkinematic conditions. That means at the initial phase, before you had a lot of structural changes, tectonic changes, what happened first? What was the material? And then secondly, thereafter, what happened after that initial deposition, that initial formation of the trap? What really happened? So that speaks to the syn or post-kinematic history. So why do we care? Of course, we care because we understand that local and regional tectonics have direct impact on two things here: trap size and trap integrity. Okay, so we're not only interested in whether there's a trap, but we're asking ourselves, what's the size and what is the chance that that trap works? What is the chance of success? And then we also ask these questions because we know that in a genetic sense, if you're thinking about it in form of extensional tectonics, compressional domain or tectonics, transitional or the linked system or the medial areas, the traps you see in these areas have their unique behaviors or their unique characteristics. So we want to know what risks are associated with, if I find a trap in an extensional, normally faulted regime versus in the distal areas where you have thrust sheets, what do I expect in terms of trap size, trap integrity, and a whole lot of other questions that come with that. And in all of this, we're interested in knowing, where do we have low risk, volumetrically robust traps? Where do I have traps that have very low risk of failure? And in terms of size, there's something really appreciable. And that's where we're all headed as subsurface scientists. Okay, so let's quickly take a look at sediment or strata thicknesses and how they help us figure out the timing of initial deformation. Again, this is me assuming that we know a lot about these things, but just for once, let's take a look at these things again and then build on our stories going forward. Now imagine a simple, normally faulted section like this. What you will first notice is that we have two faults and we have two different stratigraphic layers, A and B, right? You will notice that if you focus on fault 1, across the faults, if you notice across the fault, layer A is thicker on the hanging wall or the downthrown block, while layer B is same across the fault. And then if you focus for a moment on fault 2, you will notice that layer A is the same across, the fault 2, while layer B shows some, increase in thickness across the faults. So that is telling us something, okay? In this context, in this case, let's assume that A is Miocene and B is Pliocene, right? Like I did say, for fault 1, layer A shows growth or thickening across the fault. And what does that tell us? In this case, it tells us that fault 1 formed or became initially active during the deposition of that layer A, and then it healed after that phase, after the Miocene, after which we now had the layer B deposits, and then maybe the faults now, progressed or continued. And then if you focus on the other one, also the faults 2, you will see that the reverse is the case for the Pliocene interval, where you see thickening across the fault. So what that simply says is that fault 1 is Miocene in age, because we are seeing a thickening across the interval that is of Miocene age across that fault, and no change in thickness for the interval above it as the Pliocene. While fault 2 is Pliocene in age, because that is where we see growth across that fault. Again, in all of this is not just for the science of looking at strata thicknesses. We're interested in knowing, when did this fault start? So if I'm telling myself that I have a trap, let's say for some reason I figure out that I think we have a trap in this area around fault 1, the question is, do I think that is going to work? Knowing very well that fault 1 was active during that period, during the Miocene. Do I think that trap is going to be successful or is going to be a failure? And then the same question you're going to ask yourself if you're looking at fault 2. If I have a trap, has the faulting healed? Has there been movement? Is the movement in progress during the deposition of that interval, or has it stopped? And those are the questions you're asking yourself, because it has direct impact on whether your trap works or not. Now let's look at a scenario where we're looking at folds. Here we're looking at a simple, anticlinal fold. You have 4 layers here, 1, 2, 3, 4. What you will very quickly observe is that layer 1 and 2, right, have preserved thicknesses. Like the thicknesses are the same if you just, for a minute, look at both of them. But then you will notice that layer 3 and 4 show thin towards the crest of the structure, And then the question is, what does that matter? How does that, what's the implication? If I'm thinking that, okay, I think I have a trap right up here, if you can see my annotation, the question is, knowing very well that this structure was active during the deposition of this particular layer 4, do I think that trap is going to be successful? Knowing very well that as at the timing of the deposition of that layer 4, this structure, let me just say, this structure that was originally this at time T1 became that at time T2, and then eventually at time T3, we started having some kind of, buckling. And then that was when the third layer started coming on. So you will notice that layer 1 is preserved, 2 is preserved, because as at that time, the fold had not started forming. And then you progress to when you now have layer 3, which meant as at that time, the buckle has started forming, same time that layer 3 and incidentally eventually layer 4 got deposited. That means that I will be more comfortable looking at the trap that formed in layer 1 or 2, because the system was not, by the time this folding had started, those layers were already in place, and whatever you have there will be preserved. But as a layer 3, because it's active, if I had hydrocarbon migrate up as at this time 3, it's unlikely to be preserved, because there's an actual change happening to the rock, and things are probably going to find their way up deep. Again, this is just, an extreme scenario I'm trying to paint, There are cases where it works, but at the first look is we want to go to an interval where we are sure that the structure has healed, after which we now had, hydrocarbon migrate into it, as opposed to an interval where you thought the structure was actually forming or active when that interval was being deposited. The worry is that in terms of thicknesses, I worry. And then secondly, you also worry that, okay, maybe at the crestal parts, whatever you had them migrate up there as hydrocarbon molecule might not be preserved because of the timing of the structure. So we keep all of this in mind while we are looking at these systems. Thicknesses are very important. They tell us a lot in terms of when a fault started or when a fold started, and then maybe subsequently. I will show you a more interesting version of this story, but this is just a simplified model where we're looking at thicknesses and using that to figure out when did this fault start forming, when did this fold, when was the onset of formation of this fold. Because remember, hydrocarbon will only go into a zone where the trap is already in place. If the trap is not in place, the hydrocarbon molecule will just keep moving up, okay, to keep just going to a shallower depth. So if layer 1 and 2 are formed and are already in place, and then at time T3, a molecule of hydrocarbon comes, it is likely going to stay here than go to a layer where there is still an actual structural deformation going on, because it's likely going to find its way up. So it is layer 1 and 2, assuming that these are good sands, and assuming that layer 3, for example, is a seal, layer 1 and 2 will be the preferred domain for the hydrocarbon molecule. Now, let's look at a more complex scenario where it's not just a simple phase, but we now have additional structural processes that happened, okay? All right, so just for a second, confirm, can you hear me? Anyone?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right.
We can hear you.
Okay, good, thank you. All right, so this is a scenario where we now have, we have a more complex case. So let's imagine a case like this. At time T1, you have a normal system, normally faulted system, extensional domain. See what you see here, footwall, strata, and then compare its thickness on the hanging wall. You see thickening across that fault. That initially tells you that that fault was active as at the time of the position of that interval. So if you know the age of that stratigraphic interval, it gives you an idea of when that fault started.
Hello, Dr. Ifeanyi. Oh, it's like his network has gone off again.
I'll contact him. So sorry.
I'm trying to call him now. It's not even picking. That one's the...
He has joined now.
Okay.
Let me know if you can see my screen again.
We can see your screen.
All right.
Your network is
at time
unsteady.
T1, okay, so at time T1, we have this extension, simple trap formed, normal faulting. At time T2, for some reason, you have shortening. In this case, if you notice the offsets between the strata on the footwall.
We can't hear you now.
You can't hear me again?
I can hear you. I can hear him. Oh. Let the audience confirm. Okay. Can we hear him?
Yeah.
We can.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you
hear you?
Okay.
All right. So at time T,
go ahead.
Normal faulting. At time T2, you see the sense of movement. What you have on the hanging wall has moved up deep. and then that delta T that we saw at time T1 is now reduced to nothing. In this case, the question you're asking yourself is, that trap that's formed initially, is it preserved or is it breached? Right? That's the second question. And then at time T3, let's assume that that continues, and we now have a totally inverted system where what was a normal fault has become reversed at that time. You can tell just simply by looking at the sense of thickening across that fault. Normally, you expect it to be thicker on the hanging wall, but that is the reverse at time T3. So it tells you that the sense of movement is opposite, because we expected that the thicker part would be on the hanging wall, but that has changed. Okay, so what this is telling us is that at different times, this trap has gone through a lot. And then more recently, let's say at time T4, for some reason, let's assume that there is some kind of stress release, and the crestal parts of that structure, the anticline, is now faulted, and then you now have crestal faults, and that trap is even further complicated. Okay, so what is the key thing to take away here? When rocks have been subjected to multiple phases or different phases of deformation, they actually get altered in terms of their trap. Firstly, the size is one thing. Another thing, the integrity, and the chance of finding hydrocarbon in this trap is also significantly impacted. Because at the initial phase where it was just a simple deformation, you could tell that, okay, this is what happened. But then eventually, you now have additional phases of deformation, either because you have crustal, you have the strata shortening, either because of space constraints, you now form buckles. What was now normally faulted initially at this time T1, at time T2, it looks as if it's kind of becoming further buckled, which is good for the trap, right? In terms of your whatever column height that you expect that trap to hold. But the question is, what if I now have leakages from the hanging wall to the footwall? What if that fault is not sealing? What if I begin to lose, my hydrocarbon to the shallower reservoirs? And then that continues, and then you now have faulting at time T4. So this even further complicates the integrity of your trap. So what we are saying is that there's a lot to think about when you're looking at a trap. Again, keeping in mind the area where you are located. So let's just dive into a bit of a more regional scale look at this. In my abstract, I talked about domains, structural domains. So let's see how some of these different domains, what they look like and the impact it could have on the trap style or the trap size that you have in a different location. Okay, so this is an example of a transect from the eastern Niger Delta Basin. What you notice very quickly is from the hinterland, where you have the up-dip areas, towards the basinal areas, that's to your far right, you see difference in the kind of faults, in the kind of traps that you see. Towards the up-dip area, that's towards the north, right? You're seeing more of normal faults, right? And then across these faults, you're seeing thickening across those faults. So these are growth faults. And then in the central area, which we call the transition zone, that's why it's called a linked tectonic setting. So it's up deep extension, down deep compression. Okay, and then there's some central area where you have some kind of linking, and that's usually characterized by detachment, high or low relief detachment fold. So everything you see underneath this structure, for example, is an example of a detachment fold. They may be symmetrical, sometimes they may be asymmetrical. So what you will see overall, the key thing to note here is that compression in the basinal areas, so that's the distal part of it. All this folding you're seeing here are influenced by rapid loading. That's from the hinterland towards the basin, rapid loading leading to space issues. So if I'm pouring into a particular area and at a point, I'm pouring at a rate that exceeds the amount of accommodation or available space, what you will see is buckling. Okay, what you see is buckling, like some kind of folding, which is what we're seeing. So this folding you're seeing are not because of crustal shortening, but they are primarily as a result of space constraints or some other local tectonics that have caused these structures. Fault bend or fault production folds in the proximal areas, like you see here. Let me just highlight that for a minute. In this area, that's an example of a, you see a fold there. It could be more in the extensional domain, sometimes close to transitional domain. But the key thing here is that they are triggered by also space constraints due to backstepping of the sedimentary strata. When I say backstepping, I mean at initial phase, sediments are moving towards the basin, right? At a point, there is a saturation in terms of the volume of sediment that space can take. What now happens is that at a point, you now have some kind of back, kind of a pushback, really. So whatever you had there in place will now create a buckle like this, which is good for us because we're looking for traps, right? But then we're saying that this is not as a result of crustal shortening or so, but because of space constraints, because of backstepping of the earlier prograded strata, which had made their way towards the basinal area. Okay, so focus on these arrows in the what I'm showing here. So when you see back thrusts or forward thrust like this, by the way, when you have the force, verging towards the basinal area, it's called forward thrust. When they're actually towards the landward area or hinterland, it's called back thrust. Okay, so what you see here is that when the rate of uplift exceeds the rate of sediment supply, you will have a back thrust forming. In this case, a synkinematic back thrust. Okay. On the flip side, when the rate of sediment supply, the rate of loading into this basin, when it exceeds the rate at which the sediments are getting buckled or making a vertical, some kind of vertical aggradation, what you see is that the forward thrust will continue to propagate basinwards. Again, that's just to give you a bit of, in terms of processes, how do back thrusts form versus how do forward thrusts form. But more importantly, let us keep in mind, if you notice, I put a box here, right? Keep in mind the distinct structural plays in each domain. In the extensional domain, what do I expect to see? I will show you some example, but in extensional domain, what are the kind of structural plays? What examples do I expect? Okay. In the transitional domains, what do I expect? In the compressional or distal areas, what do I expect? And then think of it in terms of trap size, trap integrity, trap geometries, and a bit of history that has happened to the trap. Okay. So this other line, again, shows a similar thing, but here I was just trying to point out the impact of just using thicknesses to make sense of what has happened in that area. You will see here, I did talk of inversion. What was originally a normal fault had become inverted to become. So areas, everything you're seeing here was initially down thrown. So you probably initially had a fault that was doing this, and then you have hanging wall and footwall doing footwall here and the hanging wall on the other side, in which case the thicknesses you saw thicker units on the hanging wall, but after some time, because of space control, like I talked about buckling, you now have a reversal in the placement. So all this package you're seeing were originally deeper, but now most of them are looking shallower because of what happened thereafter. And then we can tell because we're looking at thicknesses of this, let's say between the yellow and the cyan color. The observation is that this huge fault was originally a normal fault, and then after some time, we now have a sense of reversal because of, buckling that you saw. So the truss sheets you see in the basinal areas, these truss sheets here, I just highlighted them, are formed as a result of local barriers. So at initial phase, the whole basin is loading. Things are moving from the source, like up deep, down towards the down deep, moving out. At a point in the distal areas, in the basinal areas, things become saturated. What you now see is instead of lateral movement, you now have more vertical aggradation or vertical stacking or vertical movement. And that's how some of these truss sheets eventually form. And then if that continues, at a point where there's saturation in terms of amount of space available in the distal areas, things begin to backstep or act as a barrier or ridge, right, to the next set of prograding packages. What you now see is vertical stacking. You now see back thrust forming, you now see traps that are shallower, because that's the only way you have these shallower traps, shallower anticlines, as opposed to the initial scenario where you expect them to be in the deeper settings. Okay, so we keep that in mind. And then transpressional and stress relief signatures here show as truss wedges. So think about it this way. At a point in time, there will be some form of shearing or tearing of this sets of rock. That will be translational movement. And then it will lead to release of stress because, of course, there's a lot of saturation in terms of space. What you now see are sets of faults, crestal faults you see. Those are stress relief faults. And in some other cases, you also see what we call truss wedges, right? Those are, again, indication that this area is saturated. There's need to release the energy, and then you now see things popping out as, reverse faults on the crestal parts of it, and then some normal faults on the upper part of that structure. So those are all indications that there is a space constraint, and whatever we're seeing here has got is in reaction to sedimentation versus local tectonics. But in all of this, again, I always say, keep in mind, what domain am I looking at? What is the size and integrity of the trap in that area? What risk is associated with the trap? So if I look at the trap in this area, for example, versus this kind of trap, versus, let's say I have a triangle here that forms another trap, right? Question is, which of them do I want to go for? What is the challenge with each of them? What is the strength of each of them? Okay, so that's one thing to keep in mind. So for 1 more minute, let's look at this whole section without all those multiple annotations. We think about these things: trap size and trap risk. And remember, I did say nearness to the sea. I did say how shallow is your trap. Again, in a case like this, where they've been in the distal area, where they've been vertical, movement, and your traps are now shallow seated. Again, because of, like I did say, struggle for space. If I can't move lateral, the next thing is got to move vertical, and I get to stack up. And what that means is that the trap is now closer to the sea floor, right? So the question here is, what is the thickness of the overbody above my trap? Is this sufficient? Do I think the trap is going to work? What is the mechanical steel of those rocks above it? Do I think it's good for this trap? Considering that there might be multiple stages of structuration in this area, what is the chance that that trap is going to fail, leak? You think about inversion, areas where you have inversion. What about reactivation of faults, where at a particular time, a fault formed, and then it healed, and then eventually got reactivated? What does that do to my trap? Whether you're on the extensional domain or on the compressional domain, what does that do to it? And then, as business folks, we ask ourselves, okay, assuming I have a trap and it's going to work, right? Assuming I'm interested in this interval, it's going to work. How many wells do I need to develop it? Thinking about the size, thinking about how complexly faulted it is, right? There are areas where you can have multiple faults. How many wells do I need to develop it? What is the spacing? Does that make business sense? Should I go for this? Again, that is assuming that you already have hydrocarbon in place. Okay, so these are questions that we all ask ourselves. So the subsurface guy is asking, is this trap working? Okay, do I want to go there? Do I want to spend this money? Do I have sufficient hydrocarbon in place to justify this amount of money I'm spending? Okay, so these are questions that you keep asking yourself. One more time, can anyone confirm if you can hear me, please?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right, still doing good, thank you. All right, so this section is just to show you some possible genetic trap styles. Again, dependent on the history of the interval, dependent on the domain, whether you're in an extensional domain or transitional domain or in a compressional domain. First one, top left, you have trusted anticline play, because, and then you have this subthrust play. I mean, these are all kinds of acronyms. The key thing is I'm asking myself, all my subthrust plays, what is their characteristics? Are they big? Are they small? Are they complex? Are they shallow? Are they close to the sea floor? And then I want to use that knowledge in determining where else do I find these and what else do I expect, okay? And then this is tied to, again, in the normal system where you have growth faulting, followed by thrusting or inversion, and then followed by keystone or crestal faulting. Again, keep in mind, the history is very important. Sequence matters here, okay? Imagine the second scenario where you have normal faulting, followed by thrusting, followed by steam kinematic deposition, and then post-kinematic erosion. That's right above it. So you had normal faulting initially, and how do we know it's normal faulting? We're looking at the thicknesses of the layer, right? This layer X, across this fault is thicker. So initially there was normal faults. But somewhere along the line, we see that further out, you now saw this part of it buckle. So maybe there's some kind of space constraint, there's vertical movement leading to that buckle, creating a sense of reverse movement. Of course, you can see this package. Here, you see what it's doing on the other side, so it's reverse movement. And then there's some kind of steam kinematic deposition, that's layer Z, happening at the same time where you had that thrusting happen. And then much later, you now have erosion that came back much later. So the question I'm asking myself is, keeping all of this in mind, what does that do to my thrusted anticline play, my fault play or normal fault play, faulted rollover play? What does that do to it? Keeping in mind the timing. And then the same applies to the other scenarios where you have forward thrust, followed by back thrust, followed by post-kinematic erosion. And then in this other area where you have detachment folding, that's where you have that's in the transitional area, detachment folding, followed by normal faulting, and then faulting being reactivated. What does that do to your trap? What does that do to the chance of finding hydrocarbon in place? Okay. So this is just to challenge you and just get you to think that about this complexity that we see in the different domains: extensional domain, transitional domain, decompressional domain. Think about trap size, trap integrity, history of deformation, and what that does to your chance of finding hydrocarbon. Okay, so this guy is still thinking, what will I find? Will I find hydrocarbon? What scenarios are out there, especially where you have multi-phase deformed traps? So let's quickly look at, before we round off, 3 scenarios where, depending on what happened or the sequence of what happened, you may have a sealing, a working or a not working trap. So in this first scenario, we are assuming that the fault is not sealing and the shales have poor sealing potentials. In other words, this the fault here is not sealing, but the shales are not entirely great, but we have a trap configuration. Okay, so at time T1, early migration of hydrocarbon into the trap, and then the fault's not sealing. What that means is that it is only this configuration here that can keep things in place. Anything that goes through this fault will find its way out because the fault it's not going to keep it in place. The shale is not entirely sealing, but we're able to still manage to keep some hydrocarbon, but maybe not a lot of column heights. Okay, now let's assume that at time T2, this whole process continues, like I did show earlier on. This separation, this offset between the hanging wall, the foot wall, and the hanging wall strata gets further reduced, right, to nothing at this time, to 0. What you will now see is that you now have, juxtaposition between what you have on the hanging wall and what you have on the foot wall. And again, at this time, remember that we did say that the shales are not excellent seals. So you are likely going to lose things, maybe because of heating, because you have fractured the crestal part, or because you have exceeded the capillary entry pressure of the overburden rock material. So what that means is that you're losing your hydrocarbon. So, and then the fault is leaky, so you're unlikely going to preserve anything. So what we're saying here is that with change from T1 to T2 to T3, right, what was initially a likely, potentially successful trap configuration has gone from that to a scenario where the hydrocarbon escapes, okay, because the rock is fractured, we exceeded the capillary entry pressure, the seal has been breached, because we did say that the seals are not excellent seals initially, and the fault, of course, is leaky, so nothing works. So what that means is that in this case, we don't have oil and gas, oil only on the hanging wall during the phase 2. We have oil and gas or oil only on the hanging wall during the phase 2, but after a while at phase 3, with continued deformation in this area, we lose everything basically on both hanging wall and the footwall. So this is one scenario. And then imagine another scenario where the shales have very good sealing potential. Okay, so same scenario, same equation, but the outcome here is that we now have oil and gas in the hanging wall. The column height again will dependent on where you have this leak point, right? We did say that again, this fault is not sealing. What it means is that the moment a molecule, the molecule goes from below here, gets to the top, it can't move further, and it starts to backfill, kind of fill downwards. If it gets to a point where it goes from this contact down to this contact, it gets to this point where it's able to hit that fault plane, that leak point, is going to go across. Okay, but because that fault is not sealing, everything is just going to go out. That means we're going to find hydrocarbon only on the hanging wall and nothing on the footwall, because the fault is not sealing, but we have a good seal that can keep things in place in this scenario. And then in the third scenario, we have non-sealing fault planes. Okay, I think there's a flip here. In this third scenario, we have a sealing fault plane. Here it says fault and shales, both good seals. Just ignore the heading here. So fault and shales are both sealing. And then we also have, of course, hydrocarbon molecules finding their way in. So what that means is that the molecules are going to find their way up deep, get to the crest, and start filling downwards. And then when it gets here, because we have, like in the Niger Delta, of course, hydrocarbon coming from all angles, you are also going to be having this same accumulation on the foot. What that means is that either way, if I put my well here or put my well here, I'm going to find carbon. But the only difference will be the size of what. Okay, can you hear me?
I hear you.
Okay, so either way, putting a well here is going to be successful. Putting a well here is going to be successful, or depending on how you want to do it. But the key thing is that the sizes differ, the risk for each of them differ, and we all keep that in mind. Okay, so what are the keynotes to take away? Keynotes to take away. Rock strata, when they are deformed. Yeah. I don't know. Can anyone hear me? I'm hearing background sound.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. All right. So when rocks are deformed, they either create a simple or a complex trap, depending on the history of that basin. And like I did say, we need to keep in mind what's the regional story? Where am I located in the gross sense of things? Extensional, transitional, compressional, where am I located? And what is the history? It's very important to know because it has direct impact on the trap style, what type of trap you're going to see, as well as the trap behavior or trap integrity. Okay, so think of it in terms of structural domains. Okay, now the timing of initial creation of fault or fold is also very important because it kind of helps us understand when or whether a trap was created, right? As well as whether it was breached eventually, okay? And it also gives us some additional insight on, the chance that that hydrocarbon that found their way into that trap, if they did, whether those hydrocarbon are preserved or not. And then another important note here is that sequence matters. If you notice, I did show a section where I showed you examples of different structural play types, okay? You might have a structural play that's successful at one time, but because it's been subjected to additional phases of deformation, the trap might become breached eventually. So polyphase deformation is one thing that we keep in mind because it impacts whether a trap is going to work or whether you're going to find the desired fluid type. So across-fault juxtaposition and connectivity is one important element that we kind of use to study these things as subsurface scientists. You also want to think about the sealing potential of the fault zones, keeping in mind the history of that sub area or sub basin, the depth of burial. Okay, what you had as a deep-seated anticline might over time become buckled or thrown buckled up or brought to shallower elevation where it might become degraded by bugs, and that trap becomes a risky one. Okay, so keep that in mind. Then the formation conditions also might change. Depth is important. They all affect fluid properties. They all have important impact on, whether that fluid is going to be able to survive that depth or that location of that trap. Okay, so these are things that I thought to share. In conclusion, the different tectonic provinces have different history and different genetic trap styles. Depending on what part of the Niger Delta you are, you may see similar signatures on whether the east or western Niger Delta. And as subsurface scientists, we use the knowledge of this regional domains and tectonics and genetic differences to guide how we go hunt for hydrocarbon. Okay, we're thinking in terms of trap size, geometry, column heights. Do I see a range of column heights here and I don't see it in this other domain? What does that tell me? How do I help going forward? Okay, integrity of the traps, risking. What message am I getting if I'm looking at the ones in the extensional domain, in the transitional domain, and the compressional domain? Those are very, very important. And finally, in our search for low risk hydrocarbon traps, we keep all of this knowledge in mind, especially knowing very well that in frontier locations, like areas where you don't have significant data or where you don't have a lot of wells, where you're just like new exploration areas, knowledge of the known will help us de-risk or better understand the unknown. So what I'm saying is that this concept is very important and it finds significant application in de-risking new plays in frontier areas, as well as mature development areas where, of course, you already know what is there, but you want to know how many wells do I need and what are the volumetric implications. So that's what I have to share. I know the network has been unfriendly, but I do hope you picked maybe one or two things in this sharing session. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ifeanyi Obi. I remember that I rushed through the opening remarks because I was so excited to hear, prepared myself to hear what you will present to us today. As I earlier said, you put geology and the economy of a nation in just three interrelated elements. And that was just what happened this afternoon. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. So I just want to do a recap of what you have presented to us, discussed so far. Now, Dr. Ifeanyi talked us through, we started with a definition of what a trap is. I won't say we all know that, but I just want to say it again, the word is said it. He said it's an area where hydrocarbon accumulates, which is very, very, very important. And those three elements he puts together are the major bedrock that houses our hydrocarbon. He also mentioned how the rocks are alterated, in other ways, the deformational processes that take place that will make us to be sure of our trap integrity, make us to be sure of the presence of hydrocarbon in that trap and the risk that are involved when those elements come to play. We saw a section from the hinterland to the basin that help us to define the structural elements, or more or less the place, the trap from the hinterland to the basin, and the kind of deformation that occurs in those in that stretch from the hinterland to the basin, and how this impacts on the presence of hydrocarbon in the traps, why the traps fade, why there is risking attached to this trap trapping configuration across that entire length. You also do justice to the relationship with strata thickness and a movement of sediment across this structural place from the hinterland to the basin. It also made us to see how hydrocarbon are preserved in these trapping styles, which is very, very important because that is our business, and the thickness, how they are impacted across faults. And also he made us to realize the timing, very, very important, the timing of the formation of these traps, very, very important in trapping of this hydrocarbon. Then he also talked us through this, how do I put it now? The tectonism of the basin. You know, I mentioned it in a way that is the extensional, the transitional, and the compressional basin. And it makes us to understand how this also impacts the presence of hydrocarbon. It also shows us how the traps are affected in this deformational process in the basin. And another part of this discussion that interests me most is the sealing and not sealing potential across faults that leads to the preservation of hydrocarbon within these traps. This afternoon, I just want to say thank you, Dr. Ifeanyi Obi, for doing justice to this topic. I don't know how to put all this together, how you brought this to play, how you put it across to the audience today. I say thank you very, very much. My head is full. I don't know where to even start from. My head is full right now. I think I need to go back and settle down, maybe ask you to send us the slides so that we go through this schooling of bringing the oil industry in just 3 elements, bringing geology together in just 3 elements. Thank you so much, Dr. Ifeanyi Obi. We appreciate you. Thank you. Now we are going to the question and answer session. So I think Professor Juliet can take it from there. Thank you so much. We appreciate you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thanks, Napi.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Lima. Thank you so much, Ifeanyi. In fact, we appreciate you. God bless you. We appreciate Zomobu too for giving you the opportunity. They did not approve, you won't be here today. Thank you so much. So the floor is open for questions. If you have questions, please raise up your hands and indicate, or you want to send it through the chat room, please do that.
Good afternoon, all.
Good afternoon. Okay.
Yes, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. There's a question from Mr. Victor Towolu. He's asking, can the presenter please explain back thrust and fault thrust?
Okay, just give me a minute. Let me go to a slide that will help with that. I need to share my screen, if that will help. Okay, let me know if you can see my screen.
It's coming up. It's not yet up.
It's coming up now.
Okay.
I can see it now.
Okay. I'm just going to try to, sketch if that will help. Okay, just 1 minute. All right. I'm going to try to sketch, okay? So forward thrust and versus back thrust. I think the first thing we need to think of, we need to do, okay, let me use a blank slide instead of my assessment section. Can you see a blank slide?
Yes.
Okay, so first, let's think of it this way. You have land going towards the sea. So this is, to your right is ocean. To your left is land, okay? So the way it works is the sediments are on their way, from the hinterland or from the source or from the land, going towards the basin, okay? So that's first thing I want to mention. Eventually, what you have is a system where you have, let's say, any fault that you see, let me put it this way, any fault that you see heading towards, or what we call vergence. Okay, you know what? Let me not use this. It's not working. Let me just stop this one and then use my seismic section to do that description. Let me use the seismic section to do the description. Close this one. Okay. Yeah, that didn't work. So let me use this one. All right. So where you have the truss, towards the right is a foreland. So think of it as towards your right, towards the distal area, or towards the basin is foreland. And then towards the land, in other words, towards the source is hinterland, right? Or because you're going back. So every fault that you see verging towards the basinal area is called a fault thrust. Okay. Can you hear me? Can anyone hear me? Hello?
We can hear you.
Okay. And then the reverse is in the flip side of it. When you see a fault, let me just use the second slide. Aha. So these ones that are, pointing towards the ocean or pointing towards the basin or pointing towards the foreland area, like I did say, remember to your right is foreland or basin or distal area or basinal area, whatever terminology you want to use. But the key thing is it's pointing away from the source of the influx of sediments, away from the source of loading, pointing towards the basinal area. So these are fault thrusts. The one pointing opposite it are called back thrusts. And remember, I used the word backstepping. So if I have a crowd of, let's assume I have a room that can hold 20 persons. Let's assume each of us is a sedimentary package, right? And then we have 50 folks coming in, 50, just 50 persons coming in. At this initial time, they're all going to be filling in this space. Everything's going to be four truss, you're going to see things buckling in this order. So you're going to see some form of like this, four truss, and you're going to some kind of, the stratigraphic intervals buckling like this. So these are trusts, four trusts. At this time, everything is good because that room is still sufficient to occupy the number of, or the volume of sediments coming in, or the number of people in this case. At a point, we exceed 20. What that means is that there's accommodation issues. We are now overcrowded. Additional sediments coming in will want to leap on top of this, or will want to, they will be struggling for space. What you now see is that because this room is saturated, there is a tendency for a pushback or backstepping because every additional load coming in is facing a barrier because the room in front is already full. You now start seeing some kind of backstepping signatures, buckling, but with a reverse sense of, faulting, which we now see as back thrusts. So all these back thrusts, if you notice, they are shallower because there is a struggle for space. There is vertical migration as opposed to moving towards the basin, because further out, there's some kind of buttress, some kind of, whether volcanics or whatever it is that is acting as a buttress, and the space is unable to accommodate additional loads coming in from the hinterland. So you now see back thrust develop. Okay, so I know that's a long answer to a very short question, but I wanted you to think of it as foreland to your right or to the basin, hinterland to your left or to the land. The initial sets of faults, the fault thrusts are formed when there is enough space and the sediments are still loading and there's enough space. But when there's space constraint, you now have some kind of barrier or struggle for space, and then you now have vertical stacking, and then that is when these back thrusts will begin to propagate backwards. Just like human beings, when a space is full, we tend to move, the remaining folks will have to move out of the room or climb vertically, climb on top of the others, basically, which is what we're seeing here. So that's my, hopefully a simplified answer to fault thrust versus back thrust, but I'm trying to give you additional context as to what they really, or how they form, basically, or what could trigger that behavior. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Doctor, for that response. So there's another question here from Mrs. Patience. So she's asking, you gave 3 cases where we have a trap that could eventually fail and the one that had hydrocarbon trapped on both sides of the fault. I noticed that all three diagrams were similar. So my question is, how can one tell which will stand the test of time and the trap that might fail and have leakages eventually?
So it's history, knowledge of the history of that basin. Again, in a setting where you have polyphase deformation, many phases of distortion, you are asking yourself, ultimately, what happened last? First of all, what happened first? And then what followed? And then what followed? And then what was the last stage? Because at the end of the day, your trap, the success or failure of your trap will be dependent on the last, the last set of actions. If you have a successful trap initially, and at a point, after some time, something else happened and the crestal part was now fractured and everything now leaks off. So what now matters is that, what that means is that the question we should be asking is, having known what happened initially, what happened thereafter, and then what happened subsequently, more recently, and then how does that impact the initial trap that might have been formed? Okay, so what we do recommend will be, it's not just I see a configuration that is going to keep hydrocarbon. Ask yourself, what is the history? What is the timing of this deformation? Did you have an erosion? Like if you look at this, we talked about post-kinematic erosion. You might have a structure that has formed, at a particular time, in which case the trap is working. But what if at a particular phase, something came and, more recently there's an erosion and we now have a layer above it that is non-net, or that is a good reservoir. What that means is that the initial trap that you had here in this zone is compromised because you now have sand on top of it, and that sand probably makes its way to a shallower interval where everything leaks off. So we are not only looking at whether I have a configuration that worked at a particular time, but what do I have? What happened thereafter? And what is on top of it? What are the faults doing? If I have crestal faults, if I have a system like this, I now have crestal faults that are leaky and maybe leaking into a shallower sand. That means that trap is failed already, even though I have a configuration that worked initially. Okay, so knowledge of the sequence of deformation is important, and knowledge of what happens. And then you now try to tie it to, okay, is it typical of this domain or is it not typical of this domain? Because you want to use that knowledge going forward in your understanding of other areas. I don't know if that answered the question.
Okay. I think you've done justice to that based on that response. There are two more questions I see on the chat. The first one is from Mr. Julius Adeoshun. He's asking.
Somebody's hand was up. I don't know if you can also flip from those who typed and those who raised their hands. I
can't even see anybody raising their hands right now. Let me check
I can see on the attendees, two persons have.
Exactly.
Okay,
let them speak before we go back to the chat room.
Okay.
Yeah.
They have Cosmos.
So today, okay. I'll allow them to speak. Allow Muyiwa to go ahead.
Okay, Dr. Muyiwa, you can go ahead.
He has to mute himself.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Good afternoon, sir. Yes, we can hear you, sir.
We can hear you, sir.
Okay. Mine is not a question, it's a comment. And Ifeanyi, thanks so much for hanging in there. This is a beautiful work. And I actually like the slide that is right on right now. I think when we look at trap adequacy, I can see the talk holding around trap adequacy. That is, how adequate is my trap to hold hydrocarbon that I expect? I think one thing that is coming out from this presentation is some reconstruction, some little bit of stratigraphic structural reconstruction around your prospect. It will help you build a story from the base from the first action to the latest reaction upon the trap. So what I'm trying to say is when we do our exploration, evaluation, stuff like that, we should look at these reconstructions and understanding the lithostratigraphic units, how they relate to structural development, and it helps us do some reconstruction that we either high grade the quality of the trap or we downgrade the quality of the trap. High grade of it will be good. Downgrade of it will be good because we will save money. If we downgrade it and we say, no, the realistic of this trap is that it is having a high risk. If it is high risk, you don't spend money drilling it. And if it is high adequacy, you have a good confidence level in drilling it. So my contribution is we look at trap adequacies and related construction when we look at this at prospect level. Thanks so much. Beautiful presentation, Obi. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much, and thanks for that ad. I know I've noticed that a lot of people, when they hear reconstruction, it's as if there's this kind of worry or discomfort. So I intentionally try to kind of play down on, reconstruction, so that people now see it for what it is, which is think about the process that has started it and the history. And then if you can undo these things, what was it originally and what it is now, and then how does that impact what Doc has said? It's very important to keep that in mind. Think about the process, the sequence, undo what has happened in your mind and try and ask yourself, what I see today, what is the impact of all those processes? If I go back to the beginning, what is the impact on my trap adequacy and my integrity? So thank you very much, sir, for that very good answer.
I think,
okay.
Dr. Ifeanyi.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, sure, you know Dr. Muyiwa now. You know him
very well. He's my mentor. It's one of my early friends. Okay. Any other question, or there are more?
Yes, there is a Mr. Cosmos Akaye.
Okay.
Mr. Cosmos Akaye, please go ahead and ask your question.
Hello. Thank you very much, Dr. Ifeanyi. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you, sir.
Okay. Actually, my question was answered by the Dr. Muyiwa, because I was trying to imagine at what stage we are in like kind of the exploration, the process. And when you mentioned that at prospect level, I just had to reserve the question. So that was why I explained in the chat that my question has been answered, has been explained.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, the next person.
Abraham Udo.
No, I didn't ask the question. I just thank Dr. Ifeanyi.
You raise up your hand. That's
much,
fine. Okay.
I just thank Dr. Ifeanyi. I've sent a message, a chat. I thank Dr. Ifeanyi for the presentation.
Thank you, sir. It's my pleasure. Thank you for being here.
From ASU, yes.
Okay, let's take some messages, right?
And some messages. Mr. Oba. Okay, it's not coming up. So let me read. I think there's one here from, okay, Julius. Okay, they've read that one. Then from Tuvia, I said, what is the role of shale tectonics in the distribution of the structures we see on those seismic lines?
So the role of shale tectonics, I mean, that this can really get to a whole new level in terms of scope of discussion, right? So shale tectonics is very key because you really are interested in what's the mechanical behavior or property of the overburden rocks, because you want rocks that, I mean, when your reservoir or your trap is formed, everything above it can keep the hydrocarbon in place. So the shale geology is very key. Okay, but one thing to mention here is that as subsurface scientists, what we do is to look at the distribution of the overburden mass of overburden rocks, basically in terms of thicknesses, because when you have a trap that is quite shallow and for some reason the volume of overburden shale above it is not enough. It's worrisome, right? So what the people who look at it at regional scale, what they do is distribution of shale in a 3D sense in that basin. What are the thickness variations? And then what's also the mechanical property of those shales? Because it's all connected to how our understanding of these individual traps, whether it works or whether it fails, whether they are shallow or deeply seated. So yeah, shale is one very key element in terms of the tectonics of it. But in this context, we're looking at the reservoir, but I do recognize that the shale distribution, the overburden rock distribution, in this case, the shale component, is very key in whether our traps are going to be successful or not. So we have more hands. I don't know if there are other questions you want to read out.
There's one more question. That is, what is the impact of the fault rock thickness and composition in the trapping system when you have sufficient charging? That is from Julius.
The impact of fault thickness. Did I get that right? Let me read. Let me see.
Yes. What is the impact of the fault thickness and composition in the trapping system when you have sufficient charging?
Okay, maybe you're asking is it the composition of the fault zone and the thickness of the rocks on hanging on a footwall? I don't know if that's what the question is, but normally, depending on the philosophy of whomever is looking at this, some corporations will look at the offset between the footwall and the hanging wall, and then use that to kind of guide their understanding. Some other corporations will look at the materials within that fault plane, that fault zone, and then what's the sealing potential, what's the clay smear potential. That's another scenario. But one important thing is across the fault, whether what you have there in fault zone is sealing or not, one important thing that I need to point out is across the fault, what is the thickness of the stratigraphic unit across the fault? Does it show significant thinning or significant thickening? Do I have a flipped behavior in terms of what I see across the fault? Does it tell me what happened in terms of the history of that fault? For a fault that was normal, now becoming reverse in terms of sense of movement, so that thickness relationship is important because it tells you a lot about what has happened to that fault when it started deforming and then eventually what happened next. That's why fault juxtaposition is one very important exercise. But most importantly, we also look at the thickness of the strata across the fault because it tells us a lot as to what happened, either to the fault or even if you're looking at maybe normal fold or an anticline. So I see a hand, Babatunde A.
Babatunde, exactly. I think he has been given mission to speak.
Good morning,
Please
good afternoon. My name is Tunde Alalade. Thank you, Dr. Obi, for the wonderful presentation. Just an additional comment is that what Dr. Obi has presented can be a little forgiving if you are in the Niger Delta, and this relates to the question asked earlier by Julius, where charge is still active. I mean, it's been active for some time and it's still active today. But if you go to basins such as those in North Africa, where charge was only active over a particular period of time and it's no longer active now, then you need to understand the history of your trap. Because if your trap is still there today, but it has been overprinted by several tectonic events, you need to know if that will have disrupted the hydrocarbon that's been accumulated in that trap before, or something else might have happened to it, whether it was there during charge, during the time your source rock was generating and expelling hydrocarbon, or your trap came in after, or there were some tectonic events like Dr. Obi has shown that must have overprinted original, tectonism that actually created that structure. So structural reconstruction is very, very important when you are doing exploration, especially as it relates to your source rock timing for generating, the time during which your source rock generated and expelled. hydrocarbon. If it's still active today, that's fine. But if it was active in the past, this will be very, very key and important. That's just my contribution. Thank you, Dr. Obi.
Thank you very much for that contribution, sir. Very, very well in order. Thank you. All right. There's another hand here. Tuvie.
I think Tuvie has asked the question before, so I don't know if it's an old hand.
Sunday Uta. Have you read it?
Okay, Sunday Uta. Okay. So they please help to give them permission to.
I think it's on the chat room. Say beside the buckling shape effect. I can't see it clearly. Can you read it from your end?
I can read it. I can see it here. It says, beside the buckling effect, which give rise to reverse faulting, which by extension causes leaks from thin realignment of strata. What else can tell where else can a trap show vague or weak integrity? Okay, maybe I guess your question is asking what else can lead to lead to weak integrity of a trap beyond buckling, where the strata becomes shallower placed. I think polyphase, I think reactivation of faults can also lead to that also. You have a fault that formed, and at a point in time, you have a working system, and then for some reason, deformation now continues, and that fault now, okay, let me give you an example. I think I can use this particular phase, this particular slide I'm showing. So at time T1, you have a working system, but because this fault is not sealing, you now have some kind of, after some time, you now have a juxtaposition of what you have on the hanging wall and the stratal interval, the same stratigraphic interval on the footwall. And then because the fault is not sealing, you have a leak. So it kind of has an impact on whether you find hydrocarbon in that interval or not. And then another thing that can happen is the crestal part also, let's say at a time T3, the crestal part of this feature gets faulted. And when that happens, if you have, for example, what we call thief sand, a shallower interval that is sandy, the hydrocarbon you have in this initial trap that work will find its way through those crestal faults. So we don't like crestal faults in a case like this, especially where you have overburden units that are sandy, right? Or where you have an erosion that came in and erodes part of the crestal part of the feature. So in that case, what happens at the moment there is a crack or there is some kind of leakage, you exceed what the crest can hold. The hydrocarbon leaks through and gets into the overburden rock, which if by some stroke of bad luck it's sandy, then it goes into that reservoir and then either stays there or keeps migrating shallower. So beyond the regional scale, uplifting of deep-seated traps, fault reactivation can be an issue. Erosion, post-kinematic erosion, where you now have sandy units, eroding parts of an initially working system can also be an issue. And then the behavior of the faults too. If the faults, for some reason, is not a sealing fault, it's also an issue. Juxtaposition analysis may also tell you, okay, what was working at one time, now juxtapose against another unit that is, stealing the hydrocarbon. So all of this can also come in, in determining whether your trap is working. That's beyond looking at whether the fluid behavior changed or something else, that happened. So this is thinking in the static sense of things, really. I don't know if that helps.
I think so. I think you have done justice to it. Thank you so much. I think we need to draw the curtain here. So maybe if we have more questions coming in, we can chat with Dr. Obi directly. Dr. Obi, thank you so much. Thank you. God bless you. We appreciate you.
Thank
so
you very much.
We'll call on the president to present the plaque to you. Secretary, please, can you share your screen? Are you there? Okay. So just go to slide 11. Okay, so we'll call on the president to just appreciate you and give Sir President, you on the call?
Prof, where will I go again?
Thank you, sir. So just it was the honor, just present the flag. The physical one will get to Dr. Obi, but this special one, just present the flag to Dr. Obi.
Yeah, I think Dr. Obi, thanks for doing justice to this presentation. The comments we made before this presentation, regardless of the internet trying to shortchange us, I think we can all see that listening to Dr. Obi and then having our own senior fellow coming to support shows where NAPE is going in the future. There's so much hope for us because we have the Obis of our future. And also thank you on behalf of NAPE for putting together this very interactive, very insightful presentation for the time that yourself and your office, ExxonMobil, has put together to ensure that they have trained you to a point where you can give these kinds of thought-provoking and very, very insightful lecture. Thank you so much, Dr. Obi. Really, really grateful for your time.
Thank you, sir. My pleasure.
Mr. Lucky, over to you. We are waiting for you.
Prof, before you go ahead, I also want to thank the chairperson. I think she's also done a yeoman's job today. What's a yeoman's job today to also help to facilitate this rather interesting presentation today. Thanks so much, Doc.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Dr. Lima. Okay, Lucky, over to you. Mr. Lucky, are you there?
Yeah, I'm there. Good afternoon, all.
Over to you.
Okay. We'll just have few announcements. Next slide. Hello.
Hello, Lucky, can you see the screen?
Yeah, I can see the screen.
Okay, so go ahead.
Next slide, please. Our monthly technical and business meeting, the announcement, please. Yeah, this call for abstract for professionals and lecturers and students. Yeah, we call on all to those that have not yet submitted their abstracts to kindly do so. Next slide, please. Membership dues. NAPE State beckon on members to kindly pay up their dues. This includes students, active members, and associates. And these are the only places that NAPE raise their funds. Student members, the amount is 2,000. Active members is still for 12,000. Associate member, 12,000. Corporate membership is 50,000. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah, NAPE is organizing a summer school. The date is from 24th to 26th. And the course, we have two courses, introductory to reservoir engineering for geoscientists. So we should kindly look up at NAPE website for those of us who are interested. Yeah. These are for our junior or for our student members. Call for their NMGS NAPE mini conference. And the date is 6th to 9th September 2023 at University of Lagos is the hosting institutions. So those of us that have not registered, we are kindly obliged to do so before the close of date. Yeah.
Oh, Lucky, are you there? Okay.
Next slide. This
okay.
for the African conference. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah.
I can't hear you. You are breaking.
Internet is
so NAPE elections. Are you back now? Lucky, are you there?
These are new members. Yeah, the candidates are President-elect Mr. John Bosco Uche, FNAPE, and another candidate we have for the vice presidential candidate is Mr. Ehi Bazai, team lead, geology team. So these are the two candidates we have for the vice presidential election. And we have other one for the publicity secretary, Mr. Olisheye Ekun Chevron, and Dr. Ifeanyi Obi, senior geoscientist, ExxonMobil. Next slide, please. Oh, okay. So these are the processes and the dates for the elections. So let's just keep them in view and keep a date and elect credible leaders for us.
We have done that. NAPE Shemu.
If it's okay,
Hello,
I'd like to
Dr.
take my leave now. Prof, can I take my leave? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ifeanyi. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. All right,
so this is our vote of thanks. Dr. Wilson, so help us do a vote of thanks. Yeah, we are done. Is Wilson there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Well, I want to say a very big thank you to every person on this call. I think at one time we had over 60 persons on the call. Our president, Mr. Elliot EBF NAPE, and all other ESCO members, national ESCO members on this call, and the advisory council members. I think I saw a couple of them on the call. The NAPE Warri chapter executive, I appreciate you to have put this thing together. Not leaving out our own Dr. Lima, who happened to chair this session. It's nice seeing you back again, aligning with the Warri chapter. Our speaker, Dr. Ifeanyi Obi, who is also one of our own in the Warri chapter here, one of our experts. We appreciate you to have done a very insightful structural revolution and the evolution and the reconstruction of what you have shown to us. We've seen that. Thank you very much. I know that this is just the beginning of good things to come for the chapter under the leadership of Professor Juliet Emudianuge. We will continue to see many more of these insightful technical and business meetings. I assure you of that. Thank you all for making our time. I believe that when next we call on you, you will always heed our call. Thank you, and thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Thank you so much. So this brings us to the end of the technical presentation today. Thank you, everyone.